Welcome to the Deep Blue Podcast, Episode 3. The purpose of these podcasts is to provide inspiration to future generations of talent and allow you to hear from successful leaders in business. Today, we've got a really special guest with us, having studied at Oxford University, INSEAD Business School, and also a person who's held multiple C-level roles across the globe, working in areas such as Taiwan, China, India, London, and for some of the widest and well-known names within business too, the likes of Amazon, Uber, Virgin, and Orange. I'd like to introduce our special guest today, who is Jamie Heywood.
Thank you, Sanj. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, Jamie, we'd love to delve into your experience, a bit of your past, some of your present, and some of your future as well. I think we'll kick off with your career to begin with. So a bit of your education. So having attended Oxford University, studied at INSEAD as well, there's a lot of education within there. From an early stage, did you sort of feel like you knew where your career was going? Did you have a planned route out in your mind as to where you might end up?
No, I had no idea. So I was born in Hong Kong, and my father was British, my mother's American. They'd met in Taiwan. So I kind of arrived in the UK very much still looking back into Asia. I arrived in the UK when I was sort of 14 years old, and it just felt grey and miserable. And so having graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I did know that I wanted to go and sort of get back to Asia. That felt like where things were happening. And also UK at the time, I graduated in 92, was in a recession. And so there were not many interesting jobs I could find. So I went and joined a trading company in Hong Kong, and asked to be sent. My first job was selling used Volvos in Taiwan. And then I asked to be sent into China to go work in a bottling factory in a place called Hangzhou. So, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I felt I wanted to be sort of on the cowboy edge of things, where the growth was, where things were happening. And then, actually, if I look at my career, there were probably 2 or 3 decision points in it where, there was a fork in the road and I had a choice. The rest of the time I was busy changing lanes on the same stretch of motorway. And I think the first one was the decision to go out to Asia as a sort of 21-year-old after university. The second decision was to then go into telecoms. I sort of worked 5 years in China, and then went and did my MBA at INSEAD, and then decided I wanted to get into mobile telecoms because that felt like it was in 98, that was a big growth area, and it felt like there was a lot of opportunity there. And so that was a big decision, and then sort of coasted the mobile wave for a while. And then the third big decision was to go into digital. So, the decision to join Amazon after telecoms. Telecoms was then sort of stagnating, and the growth had stopped. So joining Amazon, which was then the sort of sequitur to Uber and kind of what I'm doing now. So I had no idea. None of those junctures sort of was foreseeable, or I could never have guessed that's how it would work out. But in retrospect, looking back, I think all of them were about sort of finding a frontier, right? So China was a bit of a frontier. I think mobile telecoms felt like a bit of frontier at in the late 80s, and digital and Amazon felt like a frontier. And I think frontiers are just interesting because that's where the growth is. Ways of working haven't quite set properly. So there's still the ability to be entrepreneurial and to sort of feel like you can make and create things. And, I tend, when things start to get a little rigid and a little sort of stasis starts to creep in, that's when I start to get bored. So, but that's a retrospective justification on a career. None of that was visible. None of that I would have even guessed as a 21-year-old leaving college.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds as though there was quite strong, as you say, pull towards China and the Far East. And you mentioned sort of quite a couple of roles there where you first started out. interested on the second-hand Volvos. I'll definitely
Yep.
pick your brains over that over lunch a bit
It's a
later.
very good deal. Provided you're in Taiwan.
Well, never say never, right? But your first role, Swire Pacific, within sort of Taiwan and China. So what did you sort of take from that experience within your first sort of like formal role, I would say, within?
Yeah, so I did, I was a very naive graduate in philosophy and psychology, so I started with no commercial experience at all. I think the most interesting part for me was actually not the Volvo role. It was not the used car role. It was the second one. So I asked to be sent in to, so Swire Pacific had just bought into Coca-Cola bottlers in China. And I just thought that sounded like a fascinating place to be. So I was sent in to go work in this place called Hangzhou, which is now it's about 45-minute train journey on the bullet train out of Shanghai. Then it was 8 hours by bus outside Shanghai. And it was a state-owned bottler. So effectively, Swires had bought into a state-owned bottler, which had been the local tea company. And it was sort of turning this state-owned bottler, which had its own apartments, it owned its own doctor, it owned its own school, into a kind of commercial entity. And I was sent in to be IT manager, and we didn't have a single computer. So my first job was to go buy the computer and the licenses, and then to gradually start to sort of try and introduce digital technologies into this company that had been a government state-owned enterprise for the last 50 years, producing green tea, and we were now trying to help it sell Coca-Cola. And I think it was fascinating for just being a kind of a complete worldview clash, right? I mean, the people who'd been part of the company were used to it as a cooperative, as a Chinese communist cooperative, and we were trying to turn it into a commercial venture. And that was just sort of interesting and fascinating and kind of eye-opening for how you need to sort of understand what everyone comes to work thinking it's about, right? Because they came to work as a livelihood, the work owned their apartments, work owned where their schools were. So you couldn't, they couldn't leave work unless the company agreed to do that. And that was kind of, you have to sort of mentally reshift into what we're trying to do there, because you couldn't just initiate change very easily.
No.
The most senior person in the company after the CEO was the head of the Communist Party. So it was not Amazon or Uber. It was a very different place.
No, absolutely. And it sounds as though that piece around navigating cultural change and differences and challenges is featured quite heavily, I think, throughout your career, through your times in China, India, and so on. Talk a little bit about that, managing that cultural change. So how did you find it in the first instance? Was it a complete eye-opener for you? And what have you learned from working across different diverse teams and different cultural teams?
Yeah, so I've sort of had, after China, I also then worked subsequently with Orange and Virgin in Thailand, where I was setting up a GSM network for Orange, and then in India, and again in China, actually, with Virgin. And I think what's quite, every time you enter a company, the culture of the company is different, but obviously the culture of the country within which that company sits is also different. And it's very important, if you're coming in to try and sort of lead teams, to try and work out what the assumptions are about what the leader is meant to be doing. And so if I give some examples, in Thailand is a very, and it comes out often in attitudes to things like hierarchy or conflict, right? And consensus. So in Thailand, it's very hierarchical, but it's also very consensual. And if you're a leader with a bad idea, everyone will sort of actually listen to you, and the risk is they will do it, right? So there's not a whole lot of challenge. So it's very, very risky if you're a leader and you think, well, I'm going to brainstorm some stuff. Let me throw some ideas out. And lo and behold, they go and get executed. So, which is usually a disaster because leaders very rarely have the best ideas. Whereas in, so there, that you have to really think very hard as to how you sort of encourage a non-conflicting discussion about what we want to do. Versus India, working in India it's like every day is one huge argument. There's this great book by a sort of Indian Nobel laureate called Amartya Sen, called The Argumentative Indian, right? And it's a sort of, everything is an argument, everything's a discussion, everything is noisy, but it's a vital, crazy environment. And, if you're a leader, you have to then work out how you both harness that and bring it to some sort of conclusion, because otherwise it can go on forever. And, so as a leading in different cultural environments, it's really important to try and, work out what the people in the company need from the leader. And, if it is to create a space as in Thailand where good ideas can be surfaced, you need to create the space. If it's in an Indian context, where actually it's to try and, synthesize ideas into something that everyone can agree, you need to be providing that. So my sense of leadership, therefore, is very situational, right? It's very, it's not about bringing your leadership style to work. That would work one time in 100, where there just happens to be a sort of constellation alignment between what the team needs and what you're able to provide. You need to much more read into how the situation requires you to be as a leader. And that, I think, when you've been through different cultures and you've seen quite how many variables there are, I think is sort of then, it makes you, I think, much more humble as being a leader, that, you need to be reading the room very, very carefully. And if you come into with too much arrogance or with too much sense of your own knowledge or self-importance, it rarely ends well.
So, Jamie, we've talked a bit about your background and your experience within different cultures across the globe, different roles, and the cultural differences you've experienced. And now I think we'll take a trip into your time at Amazon. So when you joined in 2014, what were your impressions of the business when you first joined, and how did it differ culturally to what you'd seen before?
I mean, entering Amazon was, I think, as much a culture shock as going to India or going to China in the early 90s, because Amazon was such a peculiar place that chose to do everything differently to the way it seemed to work outside. So coming in, and confronting the sort of the leadership principles, right, which were held in absolute sort of sacrosanct, they're like the 10 commandments that Jeff Bezos brought down from the mountain on the burning bush. And the attitude to pricing, the attitude to recruitment, where, the recruitment, there were no general questions about, tell me about your experience. It was like, it was a factory interrogation of, did you match the leadership principles, right? And promotion was just about, did you match the leadership principles? So it was like being inducted into a cult, right? And, you had to sort of drink the Amazonian Kool-Aid. And, a lot of people sort of, when you were confronted by this completely peculiar way of working, sort of, you knew if they were going to press the eject button, it was likely going to be in the first 6 months. Otherwise, the Kool-Aid had sort of seeped in and they started to understand it. So, Amazon was a complete culture shock. But the more you sort of got into it, the more you realize quite how remarkable all these pieces were, and that they gelled together with a deep implicit logic. And I think the logic around which it had all been constructed was, how do you build a company that grows quickly without becoming bureaucratic? So Amazon was obsessed with sort of growth and scale. And, at the time I joined, it had grown sort of 20% plus year on year for 10 years, and it was just this relentless kind of scaling machine. And when you looked at things like the leadership principles, and you looked at, it's sort of the way it priced. I mean, the way it priced was so peculiar if you came in from the outside, because it never asked a question on is it profitable to price this way? It just asks the question, which is, we're going to match the best price that is out there with the competitors that we define as relevant. And we're just going to scrape their websites. And if that's what their price says it needs to be, then to be true to customers and customer obsession, we're going to price that way. And that was such an odd way of pricing, because usually in every other company I've been in, you would at least look at your costs to decide whether that was a relevant way of pricing. In Amazon, that was like, no, you don't start with your costs. You start with customer obsession and fairness and the customer promise and customer trust. And if you as a vendor manager or a CAP lead can't get cost base to justify it, then you're not doing a good job, because your competitors can go negotiate. And so all of these things, the logic's sort of there, but it takes you a while to sort of realize how it works and why it works in that way. So I found the first 6 months just as bewildering as entering a communist bottling factory. But after 6 months, it started to kind of make sense. And the thing that Amazon, I think, has just done incredibly well is work out how to scale without becoming bureaucratic, and so I felt we had teams that had autonomy within the constructs that it had outlined. And I think we did some really interesting stuff, but it was like drinking the Kool-Aid. It was like entering a cult.
Absolutely. So a very unique setup, work culture, almost business model to some extent, so turning the business model on its head, and that focus on the customer obsession. Lots of vendors and sellers working with Amazon at the time. What impressed you most about working with the vendors and sellers at the time when you were there?
So I used to run sort of 4 of the electronics categories. And so we, in the period I was there was this, I would say, this huge growth of the sort of marketplace side of the business, because, particularly in my categories, a lot of the sellers, particularly sort of Chinese sellers, were growing very, very quickly. So, I think the most impressive thing was just the range of different vendors and sellers we were interacting with across those categories. So on the one hand, you had sort of people like Samsung and Apple, who were very big, confident in their proposition, and basically didn't really want to play ball with an Amazon way of working. Or if they did it very tentatively. On the other side, you had a very entrepreneurial set of sellers, some of whom had built their whole business model around Amazon. And I remember doing a visit when we were sort of recruiting sellers in China, and we were doing a tour of some of the sellers in Guangzhou, and we went to one seller who sort of manufactured USB cables and batteries, and these guys were scraping the Amazon reviews and the star ratings and turning that into like deep insight to improve their USB cables and their batteries. And the entrepreneurialism and the attention to detail, and they were just so ruthless in trying to use Amazon for all the information they needed. They didn't have any other retail channel. They just dealt with through Amazon, and they mined. And then in the middle, you had a lot of retailers who were neither as strong and powerful as a sort of Apple and a Samsung, and who were trying to sort of work out how best to use Amazon as a channel amongst other channels. And I think, some of those guys found this incredibly difficult to deal with, because the constructs around pricing, drove a lot of conflict into their other channels. But you were dealing with that full range, and Amazon at the time was hugely putting pressure on growing selection. So frankly, we were just trying to add everything we could in every category, and that made it a kaleidoscope of sort of competition and conflict and different business models and different ways of working, which I found completely fascinating.
It sounds as though it's been an incredible growth journey at that point in time. And you talked about a little bit about competition there, amongst competition for vendors to obviously be on Amazon, have their products there, but But nowadays, as we look at the marketplace and other competitors in other regions, like sort of Temu, Alibaba, etc., a lot more options for consumers to find products or services that they need. What do you think should be top of mind for retailers at this point in time? If you look at the increased competition across the globe, what do you think sort of top of mind for retailers, and how can they navigate that?
For retailers or for retail brands?
For retail, I guess for retail brands and for the consumer as well.
Right. I mean, it's a very bewildering environment at the moment, I can imagine, because you've got sort of AI, you've got retail fragmentation, you've got the ability to sort of micro target sort of infinitely small sort of individual requirements into consumers. So, but I think it's important not to be kind of overwhelmed by that, because I suspect the principles of sort of building a good brand and developing a good product are not that different to what they would have been 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. And there's a great sort of Jeff Bezos quote where he's asked, he says something like, I often get asked what's going to change in the next 2 to 3 years. And he said, that's an interesting question, but that's not the most important question a company needs to answer. The most important question a company needs to answer is what's not going to change in the next 10 years. And he said, what I guarantee won't change over the next 10 years. And he said this 15 years ago, is customers are going to want cheaper prices. They're going to want more selection, and they're going to want it delivered faster. And you can build a business around things that won't change. So I think the key thing for sort of companies and brands to ask themselves, as there's so much noise and change around, is what are the things that for them are going to be unchanging and sort of critical. And I suspect that is around, a brand and a purpose and a sort of a core element of fulfilling a customer need. And if that is sort of true, that can be a North Star that then you can use the new technologies and different channels to sort of get you to that path. But whether a retailer like Amazon or JD or whoever it is really the right channel for you to put your product through, you're only going to answer if you've got a really clear idea of what your sort of unchanging proposition is. Otherwise, I think the risk is you come to a retailer thinking, well, could be good, or you come to a sort of an AI algorithm to drive individualized marketing messages to millions of people. But if you don't know what the heart of your business and the heart of your proposition to consumers is, the risk is it fragments you, and you end up in a kind of hall of mirrors. And you saw that a bit when I was at Amazon. Brands that were really clear on their strategy and what they wanted Amazon to deliver, I think could get a lot out of it. If you weren't, it could be really problematic for them, because it threw up pricing differentials, it threw up channel conflicts, it threw up brand conflicts, and they weren't quite sure how to deal with all of those things. And sometimes the best answer is don't, and get off that platform if that's not working for you. But it requires you to be very clear sort of what at the heart you are and what your proposition to the consumer is. And the channels, be it a marketing channel or a retail channel, are just channels, right? They're not the purpose that you are trying to deliver. You're trying to deliver something to an end consumer. Yeah. And so make sure that they are working for that proposition that you want to deliver, not, even if they deliver short-term growth, if they end up hurting what you're trying to do, you may find them dragging you into the swamps.
So Jamie, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about your time at Uber. Mm-hmm. So quite an interesting business for you to join at the time when you joined as well. Huge expansion, but also controversy as well. The battle with TfL, that was something that featured at your time when you joined Uber. How did you manage that situation, and being the public face for, I guess, Uber at the time across the UK? How did that sort of impact what you did, and how did you negotiate that time at Uber?
Yeah, so I left the sort of process-driven, highly structured machine of Amazon to join Uber when it was in crisis. And I knew it was in crisis because before I joined, you just had to read the paper. We'd lost our license with TfL. Google was suing the company for, or Waymo, the autonomous vehicle part of Google, was suing the company for intellectual theft. Travis Kalanick, the CEO, had been exited for combinations of insulting sort of drivers. The company the board had started an inquiry into misogynistic sort of tech bro sexist culture. So I knew all of those things as I was coming in, but I was just interested in the company, the challenge it faced, it was trying to solve, which is sort of, how do we make urban transportation better? And I was kind of intrigued by the idea of fixing this broken culture, but it was a very tough time to join. I mean, my wife said to me as I was deliberating, she said, "Jamie, have you lost your moral compass?" Because she was not sure why I wanted to join a company that was doing all of these terrible things. So I joined, and I joined to run the sort of Northern European business, so sort of 12 of the markets. And those are the markets where a lot of Uber's kind of behaviors over the previous 4 years were all coming home to roost. And the reason for that is the company had grown incredibly quickly. So it had grown 70x in 4 years. It had grown from having a valuation of, a few hundred million to like 45 billion. So, and there was a sense, therefore, within the company that, there was a kind of evangelical self-belief that therefore they must be doing the right thing because the feedback signals, which is around the valuation of the company, were all good. But it was clear when I came in that it's just in the process of being so convinced of its own worth, it had stopped listening to anyone who had anything sort of negative to say. And that included TfL, which quite rightly sort of raised concerns over driver safety. That included the issue of, the mayor of London thinking, and the mayor of a lot of towns saying, well, look, I don't want to have lots of sort of Uber, Toyota, Priuses driving around, congesting the streets and adding to air pollution. So sort of coming into this environment was very destabilizing. It was a very hot environment. It needed both, a change of the way we spoke externally, but in order to do that, we also had to kind of change the culture internally. So, internally, when I joined, everything was about growth. The story was a growth story. Success was like, how many percent did you grow this week? But actually, growth was also part of the problem because it had grown so quickly, it had just lost control of how it was managed and how things came together. And therefore, it was doing irresponsible things. You had tech teams developing tech to evade law enforcement, right? I mean, it was that level of kind of out of controlness. So the things I did, the first thing I did was sort of realize that unless we could tell a narrative, the same narrative internally and externally about what we were there to do, we were never going to be able to make it work. So we kind of, we had a lot of discussions about our purpose and what we were there to do. And we concluded that actually, a better way of seeing ourselves was not as a fast growth ride hailing company, but much more as someone that was competing with the private car, right? And the reason why that was useful is it reframed what we were about, right? And so on the back of that, we launched sort of Jump Bikes, now Line Bikes. We integrated public transport into the app. And, we did the deals on trains and integrated that into the app. We signed the Uber boat deal. So not only did it sort of change our proposition, but it was also a proposition which all of our stakeholders, the external stakeholders, found much more engaging. So Sadiq Khan and mayors, they too don't want private cars. Sadiq Khan has said, I want to reduce private car ownership by 30%, and any vehicle that exists after 2030 on London roads should be an EV. And we realized rather than trying to pitch a ride-hailing proposition, which put our growth in conflict with their goals, we should instead be pitching a broader transportation proposition that was completely aligned with their goals, which is, reduce private car ownership. Private cars are unused 95% of the time and take up 15% of central London's traffic space. And it would be the same in Manchester, same in Liverpool, same in Glasgow, same in Amsterdam, same in Stockholm. So, we had to recut and repurpose our purpose. And in doing that, think through the implications on our product portfolio. And what we also had to do is we had to think into the internal culture. So the internal culture was, it was like a sort of militaristic SWAT team, right? When Travis said jump, everyone jumped, right? And that made us very good at executing stuff, but very bad at thinking about stuff. It made it a very sort of male, machismo, most senior person in the room. When they say, let's go do this, everyone goes, let's go do this, irrespective of whether what this thing that they were doing was the right thing to do or not. So I sort of talked about it internally as a transition from kind of Uber 1.0 to Uber 2.0, because, there were some really remarkable things that the company had created. And so you couldn't just get rid of the whole culture, right? There were some good bits, but you had to work out how you transitioned it now to the culture of a much bigger company that was delivering, tens of millions of rides every week. And so there's a responsibility that comes with that. So I described it as a, sort of military-like SWAT team into much more of a kind of collective brain, problem solving, much more attuned to what our stakeholders needed. And I said to the team, this change is going to be a bit like a bereavement, right? You're going to go through a cycle, which is a bit like the cycle of losing a loved one, right? And it's sort of denial, anger, rejection, depression, sort of growth and acceptance. And I said, many of you will go through that cycle and you won't want to come out the other side. You're going to hit anger, or you're going to hit depression, and you're going to say, this is no longer the place for me. I want to go join another heroin-induced sort of tech rocket ship. And if that's what you want, fine, then we will part ways amicably. And probably about a third of the team left, right? Most voluntarily, some not voluntarily. But, the result was that the team that came out of the other side was kind of had come to terms with a new and a different culture, and a culture that was more appropriate to the company as it was, then. And, that with that sort of external face and a different external face and a different sort of internal culture, we then started what was a kind of 4-year process of trying to sort of rehabilitate the company into the UK and into Northern Europe. And it was not easy because we were not trusted. And, you earn trust by doing things, not by saying things. And so there were a lot of actions we then took around sort of an EV pledge to be fully EV in London. We, gave drivers, because, a lot of the concerns in the markets I was working in, particularly in the UK, was around driver rights. So we sort of gave drivers holiday pay, sort of pension contributions, and things that even now the rest of the industry doesn't really do. There was a big sort of tax sort of issue that the company faced. So, it was a very, very difficult path to navigate. But, I think we are much more trusted now than we were in 2018. And a lot of that was due to some of the changes that were made during those 4 years when I was there.
So multiple changes taking place. You've got a huge expansion, you've got cultural challenges to solve, etc. Would you say that those challenges really were the driver to keep you going? And did you have sort of a vision of solving these challenges along the way? Or were there any times when you thought, actually, I don't know, I think this is a bigger problem, or it can't be solved? Were there any of those situations you came across where you doubted maybe?
I mean, I think the key, the key thing I kept, if you're going to steer a team through through that kind of challenge. The most important thing is that, to go back to my wife's comment when I joined about the moral compass, the most important is that you're confident about where your moral compass points. And, that requires you to feel comfortable that you are doing, and the actions you're taking are ones that you can go home and you can look your kids in the eye and you can go talk to friends without being accused of, kind of putting drivers in precarious working situations or sort of polluting the roads. You have to feel confident in yourself. And I think to feel confident in yourself, you need to decide broadly where you're going. You need to also persuade a team that is where they too can feel comfortable going, and that they too can go home to their partners and wives and friends and sort of answer the same questions that I felt I had to ask. And I think it also requires that if the company asks you to do things that are not aligned with that North Star, that you're willing to leave, right? I mean, I do think when you're leading in very tense situations, you have to realize that the ultimate choice is you don't have to be there. Because if you feel you always have to be there, you will gradually lose some control over the direction, because you're facing a company that has profitability targets, and it has an alignment of, it's trying to align your regions with what it does in other regions. And so it's not that that's a threat you ever make, but it's very empowering that you can keep reminding yourself that I will do this for as long as I feel that this is true to my moral compass and what I want to be doing, and that I'm on a learning curve. And I think that sort of freedom is very empowering, but it requires a sort of mental switch to go in your head, right? And I think it was easier for me to do at 50, which is 56. So yeah, probably late 40s. It was easier for me to do it in my late 40s than it would have been for me to do age sort of 21 or 30. But I think it is a choice that everyone has at any age in their career. Is, in the end, you don't have to be there. If you feel the internal conflict it creates is too great, get up and go somewhere else, right? I mean, and that's an easy to say, hard to do thing. But that was the sort of freedom that I think gave me the ability to propose things into the US teams in Uber that were very counterintuitive. They hadn't made an EV commitment anywhere else. They hadn't signed a deal with a labor union, right? They hadn't given holiday pay in places. But, I felt that was necessary to help Uber survive the challenges we had in UK and Northern Europe. And I also felt it was the right thing to do. So given those two things, I made the proposal, and they went with it. So, I think a lot of, in times of crisis, it's important to look internally as well, because if you've got sort of fear in your eye, or you're trying to solve impossible to reconcile requirements from different stakeholder groups, and then you've got to know what you think is the right thing to do, and that then defines. That's a simplifying path than trying to sort of marry lots of impossible to marry pieces. That's the route to sort of, you have your head explode and probably have your heart just sort of sink.
So Jamie, that's a fascinating background at Uber, going from a real, I guess, structured environment at Amazon to a real growth environment at Uber, with lots of fires to put out and lots of challenges to be involved with. You talked a bit about moral compass in that last piece, and around, your decision making. You're not held there, and you can leave, and your moral compass should guide you in terms of what you do. Like to talk a little bit about your latest sort of pursuits and what you're doing at the moment. So your time at Zola, and now working as a non-executive director for the NHS. Do you think that is part of your moral compass, or is it part of what you feel you get fulfillment for within life? Like what's the reason for the shift into those types of organizations?
I mean, I think I found, the more I reflected back on my time at Uber, I found it very, it's really changed, I think, how I think companies need to think about themselves, right? And so, one of the things I had to do at Uber was I had to go into court uh, to explain why we should be given the right to operate in London, right? So TfL had second time refused also to give us a license, and I had to go into court to say, look, we should be continued to allow to operate. And there are not many CEOs who have to go in and explain in a court, right, in a public forum, why the country that they're operating in is better off with them existing, right? And I think I think it would be good if many CEOs and many business leaders and many managers were forced to answer that question, because when I was forced to answer it, it was not always an easy answer, right? And in the balance of sort of pros and cons, I do firmly believe UK and is better off with Uber, and I think particularly the sort of the Uber that is trying to sort of develop a really broad portfolio of green and clean ways to get around cities. But it was not always obvious. So, coming out of Uber and kind of reflecting on it and reflecting on that, that moment, which is like, well, I was, for the first time in my career, right, I was actually asked to justify whether the country that we operated in was better off by virtue of us being there. And I think that has caused me to think much more about the importance of a company's purpose. And it's also caused me, I think, also probably by virtue of the fact I'm getting older and my kids are now going into a sort of a world that I don't feel as optimistic about as I would have felt when I was their age. I feel sort of more and more committed to trying to join institutions and organizations that I think are addressing really big sort of societal problems. So having left Uber, or since leaving Uber, I've sort of done three things. I mean, the first thing I did is I joined Zolar, which is a residential solar company, trying to bring sort of digital technologies to improve the way we put solar on homeowners' roofs. And that I think is going to be a critical path of helping accelerate the energy transition. So I feel passionate about that particular problem. How are we going to transition to a cleaner sources of energy? And I think Zola has a sort of small role to play in that. I also look at the sort of state of the NHS, an aging population, government budgets very, very strained. And I was sort of invited to join Guy's and St Thomas's, which is the sort of biggest NHS trust in the UK, to sort of support them with their digital agenda as a non-exec director. And I feel, I also feel very passionate that that's something for Britain. We need to sort of engage constructively in that debate, because the NHS is a remarkable institution with a remarkable purpose that I think we can all feel proud about. But it does need to go through structural changes, and how it sort of embraces digital technologies and new ways of working. I think, I have some sort of thoughts and insights, and I want to contribute to that as well. And then the third thing I've done is I've sort of written a book, and I've started teaching also in this domain of kind of how can business be more purposeful? And by that, I mean, how does it solve more problems than it creates? So, purpose can sound a little bit ethereal, but fundamentally, if I think of the Uber world, hopefully we're now solving more problems than we create. And I think, that kind of companies as problem solvers, I think is a really useful way of thinking about it. So I've written a book that's in the process of being published about what I think companies need to do and what governments need to do also to sort of help companies fulfill their potential as a society's best problem solver.
Brilliant. So there's still a lot going on.
There's still a lot
at the moment, so it's never a quiet day. But your work in the public sector, and obviously great to hear you're passionate about the NHS. And you're quite right, is a formidable institution that obviously is going through some changes. with your experience in the private sector, how is that benefiting you now in terms of what you're bringing to the public sector?
So I think interestingly, many of the, some of the issues that I think the NHS has is it has a fantastic collection of frontline clinicians, consultants, nurses with a huge passion to deliver great care to patients. But it's found itself through various sort of successive governments sort of laying bureaucracy sort of and constraints and targets and risk reduction on top of bureaucracy, with the result that actually many fantastic frontline staff feel, that their ability to do what it is they really want to do, which is deliver great care to patients, is not being enabled by the layers above them. It's actually being prevented by the layers above them. And so if you look at the government's sort of three-part shift as part of the 10-year plan, there's three things in it, right? One is analog to digital. The second one is sort of from treatment to prevention. So trying to get earlier in the development of an illness, so you can treat it earlier because you save a lot of money the earlier you can catch things. And then the third one is from sort of acute hospitals, pushing care from acute hospitals into communities. And what's very interesting for me is if you look at some of the things we would, and so this is about neighborhood teams and community teams. If you look at some of the ways that Amazon thought, for example, about how you scale without becoming bureaucratic, I think there's actually a lot that the NHS can and wants to learn about how companies have enabled frontline teams to do great stuff. You think of the leadership principles, the leadership principles are there to try and help local teams in Amazon do good work without having to go ask their boss for permission for things. You look at how Amazon's used digital technologies and data to sort of surface, give people the tools to enable them to take decisions on the front line. And we're trying to do all of those sort of things, I think, within the NHS. And that's not me saying to the NHS, this is what you should do. The NHS knows it needs to do it. It's part of the 10-year plan. They just want, I think, learnings and insights from the private sector that has been through some of these journeys to say, look, probably don't go there. Think about it this way. So actually, I feel I'm working with an institution that really does want to make those changes. And you can see, getting rid of, or the decision to sort of fold NHS England into the Ministry of Health, that's part of taking layers out and empowering trusts and empowering local nursing and clinical teams. And I think that's a really, I find myself getting excited by that. And I find myself sort of being able to draw on some of the experiences I've had to sort of try and lend a little bit of momentum to what's an important shift for the country.
Amazing. You talked a little bit there about your book that you're working on. Are you able to share any details about the book itself?
Yeah. So the book is coming out hopefully early next year. It's being published by Oxford University Press. And what I do in it is quite an academic book. As you said in your intro, I have an instinct to sort of conceptualize stuff, but it's trying to rethink the company for the next 100 years. So it sort of it looks at the history of the company and what it's become, and it argues that actually, the companies we live with today are kind of remnants of what the companies as they were born 100 years ago. They're sort of, in Ford and the world of car manufacturing and economies of scale. And if we were to build companies solely to be innovative, right, as opposed to be efficient and, economies of scale extracting, if it was about new idea generation and innovation, we would build a very different type of company. So it's sort of unlocking that, and it draws on kind of insights of how communities have solved sort of cooperation and innovation problems. So it looks to insights in anthropology, social sciences, rather than in the business areas, because I think the business domains tend to be a bit exhausted about the advice that they have for things like innovation and cooperation, which are fundamentally social processes.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to a few signed copies from yourself along the way. So
it is as many as you want.
Perfect. So Jamie, we're going to move on to the bit of a wrap up now and get some reflection. So a couple of sort of quick fire questions for you, which we tend to do with all of our guests. So I think you touched on it as well during your conversations, and the companies you work for, very sort of tech heavy, tech focused, with like Uber and Amazon. AI clearly everywhere at the moment. How do you see the use of AI sort of evolving in today's society? And it's a broad question, but where do you see it? Where do you see it going?
I mean, I think there's sort of two. I don't know if this is quick answer, but anyway, I think there's sort of two possible paths. I think one possible path for AI is kind of replacing humans, and that fills me with dread. The other possible path for AI is more as a sort of dance partner or a co-creator, and that I think is much more hopeful and much more will be much richer for everyone. I think though, but I think if you look at where the money's going and how the conversation goes, the more we talk about efficiency and the more we look at AIs and we say, wow, they can pass GMATs in the top 99%. My risk is that sort of dialogue about AI looks like it's trying to replace people, and I think we should be trying to work out much more. How do we take the NHS setting? How do we get AI to just do the nursing notes? Give advice on parts of the scans, the oncology scans that teams should be looking at. That as a sort of as a co-creator, I think is much more fulfilling and will make work more rewarding and more efficient. But it's not replacing the oncologist or the nurse; it's working with them to do it. And I think, sort of standing back even one stage further, a lot of my conclusions sort of is we as a species sort of misunderstand why we're successful, right? We sort of put it down to our individual intelligence, whereas actually I think it's much more our collective and cultural intelligence that is the cause of our success. And I think because of that, we look at AIs and we sort of think, well, because it can pass GMAT in the top 99%, because it could qualify to be a lawyer, we kind of think it's there, it's going to start replacing us. But actually, the key question is not replacing individuals, but the collective brain that we have is the powerful asset. It's how individuals come together, cooperate, innovate, share ideas. I think therefore I think some of the AI sort of pitch is over-egged, because I think we're thinking about intelligence as an individual attribute, whereas real intelligence is a collective attribute. And I don't know that AI can replace the collective attribute just yet.
Absolutely. So it's something to enhance people's day-to-day working environments
and the way that they engage with each other, which makes us all collectively more intelligent rather than just about replacing individuals.
Yeah, great stuff. The other question we tend to ask everybody on the podcast. So what's one thing that you can't live without, either in your professional life or your personal life? Is there something that you always go to, you have to have with you at all times?
I mean, I would say my family and my morning cup of coffee.
Okay, great.
So I get two things. Don't ask me to choose between those. That would be too hard.
Okay, we'll leave that for another podcast. That one. And then obviously you've got a lot going on at the moment. So a lot of work that you're doing, a lot of, valuable work that you're contributing towards the NHS. You're clearly passionate about it. You've got your book that's going on as well. But there has to be times when Jamie Heywood likes to relax. And what is it that you like to do to relax, and how do you tend to relax?
So it's usually some combination of eating and exercise. So, I mean, I most recently I spent 3 weeks with the family walking sort of hut to hut in the Dolomites. So it was a kind of 180 kilometers up and down, staying in refuges, and the combination of sort of schnitzel, dumplings, delicious Italian sort of pasta and tiramisu meets, a large 1,000-meter climb on a 20-kilometer day. I think that for me is heaven. I find that relaxing, invigorating, and just very therapeutic.
Hopefully more of that to come.
Hopefully.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ben.
So that was episode 3 of the Deep Blue podcast, a fascinating view into Jamie Heywood's past, present, and part of his future as well. If you like this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next podcast.